Hi, my name is Aimi Hamrie. I'm a disabled scholar, designer, and organizer involved in a broader community of disability culture workers who are bringing forth critical approaches to accessibility. Today I'm going to talk about some of those approaches and why they matter. I am joining you from the original homelands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Yuchi peoples, also known as Nashville, Tennessee. As we discuss the issue of disability access today, I want to foreground that whenever we are talking about access to space in the US, we are talking about stolen land, and that disability justice activists and scholars, as well as students and employees of universities and any people who have settled these lands, therefore have responsibilities toward taking anti-colonial action. We must remember this now, even as our geographic locations feel dispersed, and as being on our screens disconnects us from the land and resources that actually fuel our togetherness. On this slide, in addition to the title of my talk and my name, I'm showing an image from the 1970s, a photograph of three people in the elevator lobby of a building. The photo is labeled Taylor Business School and is overlaid with hand-drawn lines to show how the lobby could be made more accessible. The people in the lobby are two standing people who appear to be a man and a woman, and also a man who's seated in a wheelchair, who's the white disabled architect Ronald Mace, who founded the Universal Design Movement and also drew the lines on this image. To me, this image illustrates several approaches to accessibility that were emerging in the 70s through a series of experiments in access. That is, access was not just something that you could look up in a building code and achieve without a second thought. Disabled people were inventing it, experimenting with different spatial shapes and technological tools. In this image, for example, Mace is experimenting with the idea of adding an accessible vestibule to a building, with technologies such as elevator signals with both flashing lights and sounds. When we think about disability access, we may picture something like the wheelchair ramp on this image, which is just concrete and it has aluminum handles, or this curb cut, which is a ramp that goes from the sidewalk to the street and has raised yellow bumps. We may think that creating accessibility is simply a matter of adding a ramp or a curb cut, and that if we do this, that means that there's access for everyone. We know that ramps and curb cuts are supposed to give access from one plane to another for someone who uses wheeled mobility, like a wheelchair or scooter, or someone who's wheeling a bicycle or baby carriage. We may assume that building access and facilitating justice are therefore material matters of adopting standardized materials for the sake of greater environmental inclusion. Certainly in the field of disability studies, this has been a dominant idea since the 1980s, when the social model of disability arrived on the scene, imported from activist discourses in the UK and the US. According to the social model, the differences and problematics of disability are produced by built and social worlds. They are not located in the disabled body, but in the society that disables. This model has yielded an overwhelming emphasis on physical accessibility in disability politics, as well as in disability rights discourses, and it is, of course, contested. Critical disability theorists challenge the social model for its environmental determinism. Too much power and agency being put in the built environment can mean ignoring the ways that disabled people hack or tinker with these built arrangements, navigating them in resourceful ways. Some critical disability theorists call for a focus on the lived experience of the body over the material structures of built environments. Another line of inquiry, however, comes from what I'm calling critical access studies, a subfield of critical and humanistic disability studies that questions the disability politics, epistemologies, and political economies of access. Critical access studies leads us to question access and its representation as a common sense good, something that is unquestionably the outcome of disability politics, while also maintaining commitments to disability justice that recognize that physical access is just one part of a constellation of social and material phenomena that disabled people must navigate from differential, racialized, gendered, and class positions. Critical access questions the foundational assumptions of accessibility as grounded in liberal rights traditions, which present access as necessary to enable employment and productive spatial citizenship, consumerism, and voting. It challenges the foundational premises of access, such as the notion of universal access or access for all, not by rejecting these imperatives per se, but by complicating their project, by calling into question the ontology of design for all through critical epistemologies and histories. It challenges imperatives toward standardizing access or toward making access a project that decenters disability. An important insight in critical access studies is the concept of emergence, where we find, this is something we find in the writings of disability justice activists such as Mia Mingus and Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha. Disability justice is a movement led by queer disabled people and disabled people of color. And it draws a lot of insight from the transformative justice movement, which emphasizes creating the social supports and relationships necessary to build a world without prisons or police. As part of thinking about how to facilitate such worlds, disability justice activists have also pointed out that accessibility is not a standard or logistical outcome, but something that takes shape through communication, negotiation, and interdependence. They point to the ways that disabled people have created networks of mutual aid and solidarity, have formed intimacies around access, and have practiced access as an act of hospitality and love. In this conception of access as emergent and always in process, there's also a lot of humility around access. It is understood as an always incomplete and nevertheless politically significant imperative that may result in failure, revision, and reconceptualization. In framing access in terms of emergence, I just want to highlight that I'm an American Studies scholar, and my work often focuses on problematizing how access emerged as part of nationalist projects in the US. However, critiques of access in global contexts along these lines are wide-ranging, and they can be found in the work of many other scholars, including some that I'll talk about today. So on this slide, I'm showing a collage of books that critique the idea of accessibility using tools from critical disability studies, feminist studies, and design studies. They have a variety of covers with words like design, justice, access, ableism, disability. Some show the international symbol of access, which is the wheelchair user symbol. Others show bodies posed in various ways. These books make up the field I'm calling critical access studies, which does not take access for granted as a de facto good and instead questions the politics of access. So there are author names on here like Tanya Tichkowski, Sarah Hendren, Bess Williamson, Sasha Costanza-Chalk, Joss Boys, Elizabeth Guffey, and Jay Dolmage. These books represent recent critical engagements with accessibility in the fields of disability studies and design studies. There's also a lot of work in critical access studies that's not pictured here because it's not represented in books necessarily. Margaret Price and Remy Yurgo's work in rhetoric and composition is foundational to critical access studies. So is earlier disability studies in the humanities scholarship by Rosemary Garland Thompson, David Mitchell, and Sharon Snyder. And also in law by Marta Russell and Sam Bagenstos. These critics have noted that the liberal subject is often conceived as non-disabled, and so when disability is incorporated into citizenship, disabled people are required to conform or assimilate in order to receive access. There have been critiques of what are called accommodationist approaches to access, those rooted in law and checklists, by Shelley Tremaine and Jay Dolmage, among others. These critics argue that standardized accommodations, often through the form of retrofits, do not change society to appreciate and understand disability, but instead force disabled people into existing institutional arrangements. This often results in what Annika Conrad calls access fatigue, by having to negotiate access over and over again on an individual basis. There are also other genealogies of access. As Kelly Fritsch points out, the etymology of access includes both our typical associations of access to, smooth movement, and belonging, and also the concept of attack, a frictioned approach to access. There has been ongoing work on design pedagogy and disability from critical perspectives by Graham Pullen and Cynthia Bennett, and the creators of Deaf Space Architecture at Gallaudet University. These designers and scholars seek to bring perspectives on access going beyond medicalized approaches to disability into practice. Remy Yurgo and Alice Wong critique the prevalence of disability hackathons, in which non-disabled designers bring in disabled people for advice while decentering the work of disabled people as designers. And this is akin to what Kelly Fritsch and I have called Crypt Technoscience, what Yurgo calls cryptastic hacking, and what Arceli Dokumachi calls microactivist affordances. These are all ways of describing the DIY efforts of disabled people to hack and tinker with everyday environments. But I want to highlight that most of the mainstream scholarship on access, like the field of disability studies, is written by white scholars and focuses on liberal democratic contexts of disability rights under the ADA. Disabled scholars of color and Crypt of color theorists have been doing other types of work around critical access, however. In my research, I addressed the question of how access came to be understood as an issue that only affects disabled people, as if disability is unmarked whiteness. Gina Kim, Julie Avril-Minich, Leroy Moore, and Stacey Park Milburn highlight the ways that disability and race intersect, even when an issue seems unrelated to disability. For example, in the politics of cities and the treatment of people who are unhoused, who are often disabled and often racialized. Dustin Gibson from the Harriet Tubman Collective, a collective of Black disabled and Black deaf activists that centers issues of abolition and deinstitutionalization, points out that half of the unarmed people killed by police are disabled, and that many disabled people of color do not openly identify as disabled because of the histories of slavery and incapacitation as a tactic of population management amidst imperatives for productivity. Jasbir Puar makes similar arguments in The Right to Maim. These perspectives challenge critical access accounts that center disability identity while also aligning with approaches to access as friction and critique. In holding all of these perspectives on access, critical access studies considers accessibility through the framework of what Donna Haraway calls non-innocence, that even when accessible technologies and material forms promise justice or equity, they're also entangled with systems of domination, spatial domination, domination of bodies, the imposition of imperatives to be productive and able-bodied that demand different forms of accountability. So throughout my talk, I'm going to show how efforts to expand accessibility have often produced new and unacknowledged challenges for the project of disability justice. Rather than take access for granted as a de facto common sense good, I will investigate its epistemologies and political commitments. The point here is to ask questions like, in considerations of design, how did disability come to be defined as a single issue concern, somehow outside of what Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination, and therefore untouched by white supremacy and heterosexism? How is access entangled with the politics of spatial planning and therefore with racism and colonialism? What strategies can demand otherwise? So in my work as a historian and designer, I zoom out a bit to consider not just individualized lived experiences, but knowledge itself as a material phenomenon shaping and shaped by built environments. So this phenomenon, which I term knowing making, challenges perspectives on access that understand it to be knowable, a bounded quality that designers must simply produce in order to achieve justice. Knowing making instead points to the way that built environments are produced through and by specific ways of knowing users, especially disabled users, and designing in their name. And even when the user appears non-present, we can locate ways of knowing and their material production, as well as the material practices of producing new ways of knowing. So knowing making describes a phenomenon of emergence and poesis in the sense of someone like Sylvia Wynter. And as part of that, both the user and the designed environment are emergent, historical, ontoepistemological, and material discursive. Knowing making points to the impossibility of design without a politics of knowledge, and the impossibility of knowing without material experiments in technoscientific worlds. So it may be odd to invoke knowledge as material in this way, and there's certainly controversy around it. For example, Karen Barad presents the concept of ontoepistemology in response to post-structuralism's overemphasis on language and discourse, showing us how material phenomena also contain theoretical insights that are worth exploring. I want to pause here on the concept of entanglements of matter and meaning, which is Barad's focus. She offers us that what we know is entangled with our supposed objects of knowledge, often through material arrangements aimed towards measurement, and that changes in measurement in turn shape what and how we know, and that is the theory of ontoepistemology. What I'm doing here is somewhat the reverse, because the point of reference, architecture in the built environment, is more self-evidently material, but less obviously epistemological. So my conception of knowing making highlights epistemology as a material practice entangled with the emergence of material meaning. So we end up in the same place, though we're coming at it from different coordinates, physics versus architectural epistemology. Part of what motivates these connections to ontoepistemology and entanglement for me is the lessons of disability justice and disability culture, particularly what elsewhere with Kelly Fritsch we have called interdependence as political technology, a way of talking about the work of entanglement as relation, and relation as technoscientific, a set of mechanisms through which knowing making take place. So to frame dependence and interdependence as political technologies does two things. First, it alludes to the disability justice concept that we all need each other, that none of us act independently, that our relationality has political stakes. And second, in the context of knowing making, the interdependence of certain knowledge systems with ways of making and designing also have political stakes that are, to follow Donna Haraway, non-innocent, meaning that just because there's a quality of entanglement doesn't mean that this is like a liberation-centered outcome. So following Barad's addition of ethics to ontoepistemology to name interdependence as a political technology and give agency to material knowing and epistemic making is to instead make evident the political and ethical stakes of an episteme. At the risk of speaking too abstractly, let me weave in some examples of what I mean by all of this. I'm going to talk about three variations on knowing making in the context of access, each of which has historical, political, and ethical stakes. So I'll start with conceptions of the user, which is an emergent figure with unstable ontology. You may think you know what a user is, but as soon as you describe it, it becomes something else. Many historians attribute the concept of the user to the 20th century, but it actually emerged in the 19th century in the context of industrial engineering and management. The user was a figure that indicated the human factor, a term that was used to describe the unpredictable variations that humans introduce into factory labor and machine contexts. So if you engineer a factory for efficiency, and all of the parts are working in predictable ways, the human factor is the thing that can slow down the factory. And the concept of the user and the human factor had everything to do with disability, because variations in bodily ability, shape, perception were viewed as threats to productivity that had to be contained. With the birth of scientific management, the user became a specific type of figure shaped by military-industrial norms. The industrial designers Frank and Lillian Gilbreth sought to create efficient workers by studying bodies through time motion studies, and they extended this to disability rehabilitation. So here I'm showing the cover of Motion Study for the Handicapped, and it includes two photos of a disabled man using assistive tools to get dressed. The caption underneath says, "What pluck did for the handicapped," which is a kind of pick yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. So what we find here is that the concept of the user is entangled with the ontological and epistemological category of disability, shaped by disability research, and entangled with projects of normalizing disabled bodies through assimilation into mainstream forms of work. Another conception of the user comes from architecture. The sort of idealized body and aesthetic and proportional representation of body and space that comes from Vitruvius in the 15th century BC and is drawn by Da Vinci, which is shown in the left, the Vitruvian man, kind of idealized, strong male body extending arms and legs into space. In the 20th century, with the professionalization of architecture, this type of image was combined with statistical data taken from physical anthropology to create architectural diagrams of users in books like the Graphic Standards. So dimensions of the human figure shown here is the type of image architects used for 40 years, at least in the United States, to think about how bodies take up space, reach, climb, sit, stand, crouch, crawl. And I just want to note there's this kind of random high-heeled shoe in the middle of the image next to someone who's standing and reaching their arms out. And this is meant to indicate female embodiment, which suggests that the rest of these are an indication of male embodiment. So we see how these knowledge systems are entangling to produce different forms of the body in space. There's another element of this, which is the convergence of military, industrial, and anthropological knowledge to normalize bodies. Data collected about able-bodied male soldiers and women homemakers in the World War I era was incorporated into civilian human factors designed for users. This data yielded figures called Average Joe and Josephine, which were published in books for industrial designers. They're datified, so they're kind of, these bodies, but with dimensional notations. But also, here's Alvin Tilley, the actual person, human factors engineer, who created these images, standing next to them. He's nothing like either one of them. He's a white man, but shorter, different posture, because Joe and Josephine are fictions, and they represent entanglements of knowing and making that produce things like door handles, car interiors, cockpits, and other products, but they don't represent actual people. And they use the same data that was used to sculpt these two eugenics sculptures by Adam Belsky, which are kind of like neoclassical marble sculptures with the bodily dimensions of the average adult American male and female in the early 20th century. And these were used as prescriptions for the good body in post-war US. So we can see the solidification of a certain onto-epistemological regime that I've called the normate template for design, which takes conceptions of the average and ideal body and prescribes them for material outcomes. They're slightly different from each other, but they function in a similar way to draw the user toward the norm. And this is not the whole story. So another onto-epistemic phenomenon emerged in reaction to these conceptions of the user, and this is what I've termed access knowledge. Similar to Foucault's formulation of power knowledge, access knowledge describes the way that accessible design is always entangled with specific ways of knowing disability, and that access in turn produces new ways of knowing and perceiving disabled people. This is a historic formulation. It emerged in the 20th century through wars and epidemics, the invention of the wheelchair, certain research agendas, and political economies that made it possible to think about users in a different way, beyond the norm. So this is where we get kind of conceptions of flexibility and access. Access knowledge is a historical field of knowing making that allowed conceptions of design for disabled people, fat people, and others outside of the norm. But the way that this happened was by drawing on some of the same research methods that were used to normalize users, especially anthropometric studies, which are measurements of the body in space. So here I'm showing two images of studies undertaken at the University of Illinois. The one on the left shows a white wheelchair user, disabled male veteran going up an experimental ramp, and the one on the left, or the one on the right, shows a white disabled woman, housewife, in a kind of experimental kitchen. And this is where standards came from for how much space and slope and things like that needed to be used. It's important to know that, in some ways these mirror Joe and Josephine, or those eugenics statues, but in other ways they don't, because they're disabled. And this research took place during the time of racial segregation in the US, and the research subjects were white. There is a clear kind of gendered division of space, public and private, and also gendered disability identities. And so the ontologizing structures of access knowledge, at the same time that they were enabling greater disability access, were kind of reinforcing many of these other norms of race and gender. And the standards that were based on these were then exported all over the world to shape standards in other countries. Another entanglement in the emergence of access is a phenomenon that I call Crypt technoscience. The word technoscience has two meanings. The Belgian philosopher Gilbert Hautois used the term to describe both the co-production of scientific and technological phenomenon in modernity, which is what later influenced Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway and others, and then also the technologization of scientific knowledge in military-industrial research, which is, in many cases, a nationalist project tied to Cold War-era U.S. and other countries' innovation objectives. So each one of these has a specific political economy, and they both have significance around disability. The latter, the military-industrial technoscience, clearly forms the foundation of the normate template and early forms of access knowledge. Even the sort of focus on disabled veterans for rehabilitation is an extension of military and industrial norms of productivity. But in terms of the first one, the kind of just entanglements of knowing and making, a more capacious type of technoscience emerged through specifically anti-normative, anti-assimilationist, and anti-productivity elements of the disability movement in the 1960s and 70s in hubs of social protest like Berkeley, California, and Denver, Colorado. This was a movement that asked the question, why be normal? And it embraced all sorts of tactics of direct action and covert protest, and forms of critical design and making to put forward the argument that disabled people are the real experts about built environments, and ought to be considered designers and politicized designers. So Crypt technoscience is a term I use to describe disabled people's acts of knowing making that are specifically used toward anti-normative ends. A material metaphor for this movement comes from the curb cut. The curb cut that I showed back on my first slide is often invoked as a metaphor for liberal disability rights. We put in curb cuts, we facilitate smooth access from one plane to another. There are even other metaphorical uses of this, like the concept of electronic curb cuts, that if you put in one form of electronic access, many users benefit. And all of these ways of framing the curb cut, both the smooth access and the multiple users benefit from it, are constructed by normative modes of access knowledge. So if you say you can use it whether you're a wheelchair user or a mother pushing a stroller, you're kind of like assuming that these are separate categories, that wheelchair users have no other characteristics, that mothers also don't have like race or disability. And this is because there's a kind of liberal curb cut narrative designed to integrate disabled people into these other elements of gendered and consumerist life, not to challenge ableism. An alternative conception of the curb cut, or what I call the Crypt Technoscience narrative of the curb cut, comes from the history of its emergence as a material form. In places like Denver, and I have a photo here of this, there's a protest where activists, most of whom are wheelchair users, take sledgehammers and bash up the sidewalk in an act of protest, and then they pour a curb cut using a bag of cement. A chunk of that sidewalk, shown on the left, is in the National Museum of American History, which kind of commemorates this protest. Also renders it a kind of nationalist project in the way it's taken up in the museum. But what isn't shown here, so this is the like public face of this kind of crypt technoscience. What isn't shown is the process of even designing standards for curb cuts. In Berkeley, when curb cuts were first introduced, they were good for wheelchair users, but not great for blind people because there was no way to know if someone was just like entering the street from the sidewalk. And so disabled people who were wheelchair users but sighted, and blind people who were blind but walking, they worked together through cross-disability solidarity, and they designed several iterations of the curb cut. And finally, they added something that is now known as tactile paving, which is that yellow surface with the raised bumps. This adds grit and texture. It announces itself. It adds a bit of friction. And this friction materially is what provides leverage for going up and down the ramp, but it also serves as a material metaphor for access as friction and contestation, not just smooth belonging. So there are many other examples of crypt technoscience that I'll talk about later, and you can also read about it in my book, Building Access. There's a special issue of the journal Catalyst on this topic, in which I have a manifesto co-authored with Kelly Fritsch. So I won't go into too much detail there, but I will now turn to, I'm going to shift away from the historical narrative now to talk about some contemporary experiments in crypt technoscience. So these are some of the ways that Emergence and Entanglement around access projects have been working in projects of the Critical Design Lab, which I've directed for the last 6 or 7 years. This is a collaborative of disabled designers and scholars, and our projects build media forms and various built forms, and crypt technoscience is our method, and access and interdependence are central to our aesthetic practice. So I'm going to talk about the philosophies of critical design and unfinished technosciences in these projects. So here's a story about how multiple understandings of access emerged from specific ways of knowing in relation to disability, and how these reflected different epistemological and political approaches to access. When I first started my job at Vanderbilt, there were a lot of accessibility violations I noticed, but there was also a pervasive narrative that the campus was 100% accessible under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this was a narrative of a kind of liberal theory of access knowledge that put faith in the existence of the law to enforce accessibility. Disability law scholars often point out, though, that the ADA presents minimum guidelines and we ought to go beyond them. Simultaneously, I had been assigning accessibility audit assignments to my students, where we would do an Americans with Disabilities Act survey of a campus building. And I was doing this because there's another type of activity that's quite problematic called disability simulation, where people who are non-disabled will like blindfold themselves or use a wheelchair for a day and then claim to know things about disability. And I was trying to shift the practice, because I teach pre-med students, I was trying to shift the practice more toward understanding the built environment. And so what I noticed is that we would do this activity and then the students would just continue, even after it was over, come to my office hours and report violations and explain kind of analysis that they developed around accessibility. And so I wondered about how to create this kind of critical reading practice on a mass scale with really large numbers of students, faculty, and staff to challenge that narrative that we are 100% compliant with the law. So we did a first iteration of a project called Mapping Access, where we were having a speaker come to campus. We surveyed the building, we surveyed the parking lot and the various routes, we made maps. But we quickly found that the ADA standards didn't actually include all the information that we wanted. They didn't tell us anything about gender access. Where's the all-gender restroom? Where's the lactation space? Chemical sensitivity, what kinds of cleaning products are used, or what kind of lighting is present. All these things that are really important, but kind of not as central in the ADA standards. So in a second iteration of the project, we started from critical conversations with people on campus about what access to built environments meant to them. We talked to other disabled people, the LGBT Center, the Women's Center, the Black Cultural Center. We had visioning exercises. We kind of used this to create an alternative audit, like a critical survey. And we didn't include ADA questions on the survey. We included other types of questions, some of which were kind of unanswerable, and that was the point. So, we did survey where the all-gender restrooms and the lactation spaces were, but we also asked frequently questions like, are there harmful chemicals used to clean the bathroom? And as a follow-up, how do you know? So what we were aiming for was what we call critical crowdsourcing, which is when the process of collecting data isn't just an objective process, it also politicizes and informs the masses of crowdsourcers to question the data, interrogate the data. So we organized a series of mapathons shown on this slide. There's like a poster announcing it, a photo of 3 people kind of measuring the built environment, and a photo of the checklist with like a ruler. And at these mapathons, hundreds of people participated. They would come to a central location. There would be a digital map on a screen. They would be assigned to a group named after a disability rights activist, and they would read about them while they ate breakfast. And then they would go out and survey a building, and they would submit the survey online, and a dot would pop up on this digital map that we had in the room. So there's a sense of like the accumulation of data through collective means. And a lot of people would get excited and go out a second time or a third time. And you can imagine, what happens when administrators see groups of people all over campus measuring the buildings, and what sorts of reactions there might be to that. So people experience those reactions. If there was a disabled person in their group, which there usually was, they also got to experience the access barriers that person was encountering in the built environment. And so they would come back with a fairly well-developed sense of knowledge, but also outrage about the things that were ubiquitous in the built environment that they just hadn't been noticing. In between the surveys, they would attend panel discussions like access as a feminist issue or large group debriefs. And So as a result of these mapathons, we created some functional access maps for people to use on campus, but what also emerged was a more collective and political notion of access as emergent, shifty, subjective, but nevertheless with collective stakes, definable, indefinable. And a lot of the participants use the space to develop an intersectional theory of access. They ask questions like, can a building be accessible if it's named after the Confederacy? Why is it that most of the accessible bathrooms are also the all-gender restrooms? After this project, because it was noticed by the administration, they decided to do their own accessibility mapping project, which then led to a 40-year master plan and a revision of the campus building code. And so you can kind of see how these like threads of access knowledge like emerged through this process. So we basically reenacted some of the elements of disability history surrounding the code. The emergence of code and the knowledge surrounding it led to all of these different possibilities that then in turn revised the code. So a concept that emerged from this process for us is what we call protocols for unfinished technoscience, and you can find these on our website. Protocols have a history in activist technoscience. In her book, Seizing the Means of Reproduction, Michelle Murphy describes protocol feminism as a set of practices through which technoscience is made accessible, routinizable, and doable. Outlining a protocol formalizes our practices, but protocols also place us in the middle of things. Writing or drawing a protocol helps us understand how our ongoing projects are comprised of questions, iterations, prototypes. And so protocols can also become accountability measures in this way. I've often been asked to share protocols for mapping access with others who want to replicate the project. And this desire for replicability is not to finish the project of access, but to recognize its reach into new jurisdictions and approaches. But to me, the answer to the question of how to do accessibility mapping is actually more conceptual. Here I'm showing a diagrammatic protocol that I drew while trying to explain this project to two anonymous reviewers for a manuscript I was trying to publish. It focuses on the questions that mapping access begins with, produces, and returns to. And so it's this messy sheet of lined paper covered in boxes, thought bubbles, clouds, shapes, arrows. And it asks these questions that are like, where do I go? How do I find X? But also what counts as access? Access for whom? How do we know? And on here, like the concepts of critical crowdsourcing, interrogative data kind of emerge through this protocol diagram. Another project that I'll highlight is the Contra podcast on disability, design justice, and the life world. Here I'm showing a view of what the website version of this looks like. I'll just say design justice is a concept that's forwarded by Sasha Costanza-Chalk and the Design Justice Network of the Allied Media Project. We started using this term around the same time because we wanted to highlight that access knowledge is a project of how disabled people challenge imperatives for normalcy that are built into design and imagine design otherwise. So the podcast is about how people who are part of disability culture use art, design, and media to create new configurations of knowing making. And so we use the project to experiment with forms of unfinished technoscience and disability media in line with what Meryl Alper has recently called critical media access studies. And finally, I want to talk about a dance party that we've been designing and hosting during COVID. In Crypt Club Vibes, disability media scholar and lab member Kevin Gotkin writes of histories of Crypt nightlife as layerings of culture and technology. He recounts the history of how deaf people in San Francisco rented out their community space at night for touring punk bands, and the deaf club, as it came to be named, made nightlife itself a technology. Gotkin writes, quote, "Technoscientific protocols for thinking about nightlife offer what has been traditionally absent, deliberation, design, and aesthetics as a toolkit for shaping our collective imaginations and desires," end quote. Based on this work, when the pandemic started, Gotkin, with Louise Hickman and myself, led the lab in designing protocols for online Crypt nightlife events, which would showcase all of the ways that disabled people embrace principles of remote access and participation both before and during the pandemic. So we have web streaming, live captioning, sign language interpretation, audio and image description, interactive disability arts, and the party activity itself is participating in these access activities. Everyone does these together. So on the images, on the screen, I'm showing a protocol that's on our website for how to do the party, and also a tweet that I did showing an image of the party on Zoom that has this kind of like neon art and people on their screens and the chat box. Remote access is about access as a practice that we engage in together. Each party has different flavors and textures. Not everyone can participate, but we create hacks whenever we can. So, for example, Kevin figured out that we can use Zoom's language translation channel to layer in audio descriptions of images without turning the music off. And our fellow lab member, Louise Hickman, helped co-author a set of protocols that anyone can pick up and use for their own remote access party. What emerges here is the technoscience of care and camaraderie across great social distance. It highlights the ways that we're already organizing and partying together across long distances from our beds and homes even before the pandemic, and that this is an onto-epistemological and ethical practice through which access emerges and entanglement facilitates the constant rolling out of messy, experimental forms of access knowledge. What is important in all of these projects is that Crypt technosciences are not just replications of past experiments with meaning and materiality in disability history and culture. Crypt technosciences are also emergent, entangled, unfinished technosciences. We find ourselves in the middle of access, find access to be lacking and in need of critique, and nevertheless remain committed to the project of materializing it. So you can learn more about these projects at www.mappingaccess.com. Thank you.